received and is processing and applying. I would like now to turn to Anna. Can you hear and see us well now? We do not hear you now. Maybe let's check the microphone. But in the meantime,
I can hear you very well. I cannot see you, but never mind.
Good. We see and hear you well, and that's a real pleasure.
Okay,
so
that's
you,
important.
like not many, have a very good position to help us gain a broad perspective. You've been seeing the Union evolving, and you were close to the social dimension and social policy development. And those who seek more social justice, improved social policies, often meet an obstacle that there are different welfare state models. Countries have slightly different approaches and perspectives. But overall, don't you have a sense that over the last decade or so, there has been a strengthening of the social dimension? Could you help us see where there was progress and where we still stumble?
The answer is yes, but absolutely yes. But of course, you give me the opportunity to touch upon, to connect our discussion with what is going on in the world and in Europe. As you have already said, I was a commissioner during a very interesting period. It was the period that the enlargement happened, the European enlargement happened, and at the same time there was the introduction of Euro. Today, several years after these milestones, it is the European Union is still a pole of attraction. It is still a dream for many countries which want to be members of our union. Our discussion this afternoon is taking place under the heavy shadow of fatal events due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainians, in the midst of a bloodshed, appeal for the EU to fast-track its membership application, the same the Georgians. This demand is obviously linked to the fear caused by the proximity with Russia, but also to the vision of freedom and democracy. And a key component of real democracy is the functioning of the welfare state and all its activities. The large number of authoritarian leaders, we can see so many around in the whole planet, is largely due to growing social inequalities. And this is what distinguishes the European Union from countries with authoritarian leaders. And this is the core of our discussion today. The welfare state, social protection for all, the mobility, the social mobility, particularly for young generations, are the key elements that strengthen democracy and create prosperity. And in the last three economic, health, and now geopolitical crises, Europe has matured, strengthened, learned from its mistakes, and even in countries with a very deep crisis, as Ireland, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, democracy was not threatened at all. The welfare state, the social protection systems, the family structures, the support from the European Union played a vital role in keeping the societies upright and thus the democracies. That's why the discussion about the social protection system, it's not only about the well-being of people, it's the well-being of a country, of democracy, of freedom. Now, to be very concrete, and giving some examples of progress during the last 2 decades, I would like to refer to some concrete issues. Strong reduction in poverty. And we see that 10 years ago, there were around 40 million persons in EU 27 faced severe material deprivation. It was 10% of the population. Today is, as we have already listened, 5.5%, and it's only 24 million. Second important issue, it is the progress made in labor market, in the labor market integration of women and older workers. we tried hard. There were many policies in place. There was a lot of financial support for this. Now, among women, the employment rate increased from 56% to 2000, in 2000. At that time, I was commissioner, and we had put concrete quantitative goals concerning the women unemployment. Today, it has increased to 67% in 20. And among persons aged from 55 to 64, it went from 35, it increased from 35 to 60%. So these are very concrete elements which change the society, and it is because of concrete policies. Last but not least, I would like to make a reference to Europeanization of social issues, starting from Lisbon Strategy in 2001 up to today with the Action Plan and Porto Summit and the using of method of open coordination. We see day by day that the social policies are coming more and more as a priority to the European Union. And of course, because of crisis, it is a very important factor. Now, persisting challenges. Just some words. Aging of population, demographics is a very big problem for Europe. And here there are two main issues. It is how we can ensure adequate pensions and long-term care to old people. Second important issue is the new world of work, how we will adapt the social protection system to this new world, and how we can make sure that all workers have effective access and adequate access to social protection system, including the non-standard forms of work, as already have been said. So it is a persisting challenge. It's one of the most important issues that our high-level group has taken into account and works on that. And an important issue is, of course, social and employment situation of young people. I think this is an area that we have not, that the rate is not satisfied. It is worse than it was before the crisis, and concerning particularly the youth unemployment. Last point, which is a persistent challenge, is the lifelong learning and digital skills, how we retrain, how we reskill people. And I think we cannot be very satisfied with what has happened in the majority of member states, comparing with the needs because of the changes in our era.
Thank you very much for bringing in these highlights and reminding us some facts and challenges in areas such as you did, gender, aging, youth, lifelong learning. Well, in the perspective of time, in order to be able to develop, we need to acknowledge where the strengths were. But the big question is funding it all. I would like now to turn to Milena. You have been raising new ideas of how we should look at economic growth. There's a common sense argument that, well, we can spend something on welfare if we get the growth. And is it that simple? Could you shed some light and comment on how welfare spending and growth depend on each other?
Yes, thank you so much, Tadas, and hello to everyone. It's a great pleasure to discuss with you today. And yes, it's right. I've been thinking about the role of economic growth and how it relates to welfare states in the context of climate change as well. And so sustainable welfare scholars like me argue that there is a sort of mutual dependency between economic growth and welfare states. So there's often the argument that we need economic growth to fund welfare states, especially because of demographic change, but also just simply because obviously we need the taxes and social insurance contributions, which are dependent on economic growth to fund things like unemployment benefits and benefits to low-income people. Now, there is a problem in many ways with economic growth in the sense that we cannot necessarily rely on economic growth going much further in the future for various sort of headwinds that have been identified for economic growth, things like demographic change, a reduction in productivity. And now, of course, we have all these other crises in the post-COVID-19 context and the Ukraine war. But also from an ecological perspective, there are issues with economic growth in the sense that there's growing evidence that we cannot easily, at least, decouple economic growth from emissions and material use at the global level. And also in absolute terms. So absolute terms in this context means that economic growth, if we were able to decouple them in absolute terms, then economic growth would be going up globally, whereas emissions would be going down in absolute terms, not only in relative terms. And so we don't see any evidence for this at the moment. There are some countries that have managed to decouple emissions from economic growth in absolute terms, but at very, very low percentages. So basically, it looks like we are not having enough time, literally, to pursue economic growth and tackle climate change. And so for all of these reasons, I think scholars like myself, we are concerned, of course, what that means for the future of the welfare state. And yeah, you said mutual dependency, and that is correct. I think welfare states also contribute in many ways to economic growth, or are designed to contribute to economic growth. Of course, they stabilize demand during economic downturns, and also they sometimes and increasingly so, I think, respond to the issues that economic growth can create due to technological and structural economic developments. The unemployment changes, the labor market changes that we have seen. You have already mentioned precarious work patterns, rising inequality. So there's, in a way, with economic growth often comes an increase in demand for welfare state spending. And so this is why there's a lot of thinking at the moment in terms of how could we decouple the two? How could we find alternative ways of funding the welfare state? And one idea is to shift from things like taxes on income and consumption to taxes on wealth, because these sources of funding would be less dependent on economic growth. And the other advantage would be that they create a more equal society in the first place, so that sort of there's less need in a sense for welfare state spending.
Milena, but could you explain one specific thing that matters for the whole purpose of social protection and social security policies? So on one hand, you reminded us that social spending is not just spending, it's a form of investment that brings returns. And we saw that. It's a well-known example by now during the financial crisis and then pandemic. Those countries that kept up their spending or investing in social area, well, they went through the shocks easier and reestablished themselves faster. But then, speaking about this growth and social spending dependency, how do economic cycles work? Remind us what happens to the poor, the most vulnerable, at a time when the economic cycle goes down, when there is lack of growth. And if we keep benefits directly dependent on the growth, what happens to them then?
Yes, and this is a very good question. And I think there's recent research that really shows how because we have had periods of austerity following economic crises, that often the response from policymakers is to say that if we tax incomes and businesses too much, following an economic crisis, that would hinder future economic growth. And so sort of periods of austerity can then, of course, be major sources for reductions in benefit payments and further deregulation of labor markets. And so in that sense, I think poorer people tend to suffer in these periods because the welfare state is so oriented towards towards supporting economic growth?
Thanks. Let's take a moment to reflect a little bit about the purposes why we have social security systems. They are so ingrained into our daily lives, often taken for granted. But let's think where we target them, where we target social protection policies to, and what we expect from that at societal level. A proponent of social investment approach, Anton Hemmerich, he suggests that there have to be three-pronged approach into how we structure our social policies in this century. That first of all, we need what they call buffers, protection mechanisms against socioeconomic shocks. That is social insurance, social assistance that helps in situations of losing income. But we also need to support flows or life transitions, such as from education to work, from work to training, and then back to work, to parenthood, and back, changing careers, etc. And we also need to invest in stock. In other words, in our society, members of society, in human capital, in other words. Anna, when you spoke, you alluded to some of these areas. Well, if we reflect now on the future, on taking appropriate directions for reforms and developments into the future, where does the EU have to target their policies so that we can count on returns from social protection?
Do I understand that you ask me, Tadas?
Yeah, if you could help us now look at the horizon into the future. We'll have to reform social policies. Yes. We will. And where do we put the emphasis?
I think it is quite difficult to focus on one or two areas because we all know very well that the social protection is a very wide issue. I mean, you can include everything, and there were many discussions if social investment is part of social protection or not, and I really do believe that it is. So what do we have to do now? Because in the future, or even from tomorrow, we have to work on two dimensions. The first one is to prepare ourselves for crisis. So it is to be resilient, to have resilient protection, social protection systems. And we see that every few months we have a different kind of crisis, from economic to pandemic, from pandemic to energy crisis, from energy crisis to geopolitical one. So what we have is to be prepared ourselves for crisis. And on the other side, we have to adapt our social protection systems in the new mega trends who change the whole approach of the system, because we have mega trends, and this is what we are doing now in the high-level group for social protection. We have identified 4 mega trends, which is the demographics, the digitalization and automatization, the changing world of work, and the climate change. And so what we're trying to do is to identify the risks, the new risks because of these mega trends, and if these new risks are covered by the existing social welfare systems, because as you have already said, there are big differences from country to country. But I believe that by identifying these social risks, we will be quite able to change the organization of the system. So the balance, to strike the balance between social assistance and universal benefits and other kind of social policies, and to change the financing approach, as it already has been said, we need new funding because there will be, it is already here, a reduction in social contributions and in labor tax. So we have to find new ideas and or new combinations in our financing system. And we like it or not, we know that there must be some global agreements, which has become very difficult with the world and with this with the division in the world, because taxing the wealth, it means that we have to change some of our policies concerning the movement of industries and the movement of companies. So there is a need, and I think the role of OECD is very important there, that of the European Union as well, to find international agreements concerning taxation. Already we have one, which is important, but it is not enough. So general and global agreement on labor market issues, fundamental rights, and fundamental new kind of rights, because the new forms of work have new kind of rights, and taxation. So I think this is the new framework that we have to work in.
Thank you. So you pointed to a few very important context elements. Many of them relate to this very difficult question of funding our systems. And you also called for new ideas. I will turn back to Milena now. You are proposing one, at least, new idea that is not maybe getting enough debate yet. Even among the experts, social protection is often narrowly understood as focusing on monetary distribution of resources. But you have been a proponent of public services as part of redistribution, part of support to the vulnerable groups, and possibly a part that will help us to get through the transitions discussed. So what can services do, how we target them to help the vulnerable groups, and what benefits for the green transition they can have, if you could tell briefly.
Great, thank you a lot. Yes, that's right. I've been working on an idea that's currently being promoted, especially in the UK, but I think also in many other countries, called Universal Basic Services. And so the idea would be that we have publicly or collectively provided services that directly or more directly address people's needs, people's basic needs, like obviously for health and education, for which these systems often already exist. But there's a debate about expanding such services into new areas to, for example, cover energy provision, transport, water, even internet, for example, to really make sure that people's basic needs are being met. And so the idea would be that some of these basic services could be free at the point of use. And it depends on the type of service, but for example, for health services, obviously, this is being targeted based on needs. So if you need to go to the doctor, they are then eligible for healthcare. But for things like transport and energy provision, I have made the proposal that one could provide a basic amount for free to every citizen, and combine it basically with environmental measures as well. So, for example, say we feed new renewable electricity into the grid, and the equivalent of that electricity will be provided for free to every citizen in the country, or every resident in the country. And some modeling that we have done has actually shown that not only can we reduce emissions by doing this, and it's highly likely to be much faster than, for example, taxing and then giving people a tax rebate back in cash terms, if the economy and if the technology that we have, and the technological developments that are underway already, if they develop at the pace that we see at the moment, then this would be much slower compared to sort of additional public investments into renewable electricity and new public transport. So not only is this useful for reducing emissions, but also for reducing things like fuel and transport poverty. Because, like you said, I think we tend to think of social protection in monetary terms, but the criticism is often that, if adequate services are not being provided, then giving people cash, it doesn't necessarily help people to properly satisfy their needs. If they are car dependent, then more money doesn't necessarily make them more mobile. Or now in the current energy crisis with very starkly rising energy prices, giving people money can help to some extent, but providing renewable electricity for free, could speed up that process. Yes, so that is one of these ideas that we have been discussing, and we have also been discussing how it relates to giving people minimum incomes, be it a universal income or a minimum guaranteed income scheme.
Thank you. And what we can appreciate that we've seen recently, your publication together with Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, that these ideas are supported by you with thorough analysis and modeling. And that's close to our mission at Eurofound, to bring new ideas, but also work through them, examining evidence. Well, this work will continue, but what do our societies understand? How do they gather? Anna, are you coming in?
Can I make a comment?
Please,
yes,
a quick one.
Yes, a very quick
Please
one.
Go ahead.
Concerning the social investment, which is something very important, and Eurofound has tried to quantify the return of social investment, is very important. But I think that we have to take into account that we must not test it only in terms of economic and financial gains. For instance, because this is a discussion which is taking place in many countries, concluding that one needs to invest only in children because there are many gains and they're obvious, and not in well-being of elderly people. This could be quite problematic for the societies. So it is so difficult to strike the balance when the funding is not enough, and we cannot always have priorities, concrete priorities.
Thank you. And that's a very good transition to the question I wanted to ask Bernhard as a sociologist. Anna just pointed out that different groups and societies, they keep having their perspectives. They are in their specific situations. And how do we balance them out? How do we hear them? It relates a little bit. Let me look into questions we got from audience. Some were asking, can you reassure us that European countries have learned from the financial crisis? They speak also about particular professions. How will freelancers do in the new world of work, in the new regime of social protection? Can there be measures for them? And so on and so forth. So as a sociologist, you have written a book that was titled Welfare State Reforms Seen from Below. So talk us a little bit, how do people see social protection? Which forms, which types are most appreciated by the public? Which maybe are not seen so well and more controversial?
Yes, I mean, it's an important question to think on the one hand about the policies we need to put in place for the future. But on the other hand, of course, you need also a political will to do so. In research that I did over the last 10 years with colleagues here in Mannheim, we looked at the support of the welfare state, public opinions, and what it comes out, of course, of work looking at it comparatively across European countries over a long time period, is that there are some programs that are very, very popular. That is certainly healthcare more generally, since it affects everyone, but also pensions. And in the area of pensions, there is, of course, always a challenge for politicians to reform pensions given the demographic changes. And there's also, given the current reforms, some tendencies towards cutbacks in future pensions. So that will play out, maybe increasing old age poverty to a degree we haven't been used to, at least in large parts of Europe over the last 2 decades. So in general, there might be, on the one hand, a general support for these areas vis-a-vis less support and more divisive support about reforms in terms of unemployment and labor market policies, to some degree, even family policies. And so the question is under what conditions would the public change its preferences? We did find that in the long run, there seems to be somewhat a learning curve also in the public in terms of the challenges to the welfare state and some consideration there. But it's much more stronger in those countries, of course, where you have already a saturated welfare state, whereas in countries like Southern and Eastern European countries, where they still need to catch up, people are very much aware of this. And if you look at survey data, one can show that it's really the perception that some of those benefits are inadequate that lead to a extension of that. The other finding, of course, that is very important is our way in which we basically have a discourse about solidarity and social policy. That is, the ordinary citizens has a consideration of the deservingness of groups. And it's not only, what am I getting out of the welfare state, it's also to what degree do, for example, particularly people in more precarious situation, have no control over the situation. So during a crisis, we do see that there is much more support, and more recent data with the pandemic really showed that there is a bit of a slowly shift from, let's say, the protection of the old social risks towards some of the more recent pressing issues in terms of social policies. And so that's one part. The other part we looked at in that project and book was actually the other force from below is the role of social partners and how they respond to reforms. And that's something we need also to keep in mind. To what degree have the social partners, particularly the trade unions, in reform processes, a role, on the one hand, to defend the acquired social rights, but also to rewrite maybe the future of the social contract. And I think some of you mentioned, or it was mentioned, the Great Recession, the financial market crisis. That was a moment when certainly one would have expected social partners to come together and do some kind of social pacts. That didn't really happen as much, particularly not in the countries where it mattered most, where the biggest crises were. So under Troika conditions, for example, it was difficult to negotiate for governments with the social partners. In the pandemic, at the beginning, it was relatively fast moving. Again, social partners are sidelined. But I do think that in the post-pandemic context, and even with the more recent waves of the pandemic, one could see that social partners had a role in negotiating the return of work, and they will play a role in negotiating, for example, how to deal now with working from home in the future. To what degree should that be regulated or changed? How do we deal with atypical workers in the gig economy? Again, I think there's a role also for the social partners. So I think we need to look, if we look at reforms from below, at both what do citizens want, and on the other hand, to what degree do the social partners, union, employers, associations, and also civil society basically come to terms and help to create a more cohesive policy and a consensus on rewriting the social contract.
Good. It's good to be reminded about the actors that can be engaged in policy making and probably should. You also indirectly reminded about solidarity as a fundamental European value, and we might need more of that very soon and promptly. Another question that came up from the audience is touching on subject we can't avoid today. And they ask, are there certain or any particular social protection aspects that will have to be under the spotlight now in the course of the war in Ukraine? And I'll ask you to think about this as we are approaching the end of our session. And let me give just a brief background to what happens in the social protection perspective. So first of all, we do see the brutality and the scale of demolition rising by hours. So there can't be any underestimation of the scale of the crisis there, and it's far from over. So the EU acted throughout this week at the highest level in rethinking plans, from giving temporary protection to financial planning to food, etc. But if there will be refugees coming in, we expect now that they'll get a protection status for up to 3 years that has to be regularized. What that will involve residence permit first of all. That will involve obligation for member states to accept children to education systems and care. And we know that so far we are receiving large numbers of women and children. And then member states will have their regulations. They will be expected, and they'll decide how to grant work permits, accommodation, training, access to social welfare. So can you give some answer to people asking what social protection dimensions will have to be under the spotlight? And maybe the policy directions in the EU we already have that could be employed, such as child guarantee has already been planning certain things, strengthening childcare and care, etc. Who would like to start? Can we go Anna, Bernhard, Milena? Anna, please.
Yes, thank you. This is a priority now because we know that the numbers will be extremely big. So the first estimation is that it will be about 5 million people, and the majority of them will be women and children. So I think that we already have an experience from the previous migration crisis, where Europe was not very successful, we have to admit, and in many cases we were very divided and it was impossible to agree. I think that after what happened in Ukraine and this miracle which happened in unanimity and with agreement on issues concerning external policies and defense, I think that it will be easier for the member states to agree on some very concrete principles. And the most important of this is the fair dissemination of the population of the refugees. During the previous crisis, because my country, Greece, was the gate of hundreds of thousands of people who were coming from Asia, it was impossible for many European countries to accept this dissemination. So the first very important political decision is this one, because it will make easier the life for all governments at European level. And if 25 countries accept the dissemination of 5 million people, it's much, much easier to deal with them. So after that, there are many national and European policies concerning what you have already said. I mean, papers and documents, asylum, visa when it is needed, or the important issues of inclusion in educational system and the labor market. So for me, if we succeed the first principle I said, I think that 5 million people for 400 million people that Europe is, it is affordable.
Thank you. Bernhard, Milena, if possible, let's stay focused given the time. And any takeaways you could advise, please share.
Yeah, I mean, again, we see that with the current problem of refugees, we can go back to former crises like 2015, learn some lessons from there and try to improve. So I think that's something that is really important to reflect on each of these crises as a opportunity to learn how to improve the welfare state. I think that's very important. We have discussed today also some of the long-term challenges over time, and I think that's is with us, of course, for to think those through. But really thinking through to what degree the welfare state is there not only for good times but also for those particular crisis times, and to create maybe a plea for a really a discussion in the public and include the social partners in thinking through the steps we have to take now in an immediate crisis. Of course, things need to happen much faster. But I'm also quite surprised, and it's a good development that we can see that things have moved at the European level much quicker than we might have expected from past experience.
Thanks.
Great. Yeah, I think Anna and Bernhard have already made really, really important points. So I think from my side, I would probably just stress that, thinking about making social protection systems more universal, it seems to be something that would be beneficial in this particular context with rising numbers of refugees. And also the things that I've been talking about in terms of universal basic services, I think the idea that in-kind provision can be quite effective as well in supporting people also relates to this situation. And of course, the issues that have been raised about international cooperation. So yes, many difficult issues to tackle, but hopefully they can also give us actually an incentive to modernize our social protection systems in some ways.
Thank you very much for participating, for your comments. In rounding up, let me still remind a few things we heard that are or can be taken as encouragement. We spoke about problems, but what we learned that there is clarity, there is focus with regard to main challenges. We learned that there are ideas, new ideas, how to rethink and reshape social protection policies that can also serve the green transition, for example. And and we also learned that there are ways to engage society. We also were reminded that EU is a sizable continent. Anna reminded the population size. Let's not forget, this is a rich continent that can change its priorities, its consumption patterns, and which can act fast, as we saw over the last week and days. So at this point, I would say it couldn't be more acute moment to rethink and reimagine the future. And that's what will our next session do, together with my Eurofound colleague, John Hurley, and distinguished speakers. I invite everyone to stay here for a short break and to continue engaging and sharing your ideas on social media. Thank you.